A corrupt, untouchable police sergeant lost his absolute mind on the witness stand in a packed courtroom. Cameras flashed in the gallery as he crossed the well of the court in pure, unhinged rage and struck a sitting member of parliament across the face. The room froze. The gasp of 100 people sucked the air from the room. But what Sergeant Harlan Voss did not know was that Valerie Kane was not just a politician. She was a former frontline military combatives instructor. Within moments, Voss lay unconscious on the marble floor with a fractured jaw, and the karma had only just begun. This true-to-life story moves from shocking to absolutely legendary. The air inside courtroom 4 of the High Court of Justice felt stifling, thick with tension that usually precedes a riot. The grand, oak-paneled room was packed to capacity. Every mahogany bench in the public gallery groaned under the weight of reporters, civil rights activists, and off-duty police officers. The air conditioning had supposedly failed earlier that morning, but everyone in the room knew the heat radiated from the sheer animosity between the two primary figures. On the witness stand sat Sergeant Harlan Voss. Voss was a veteran of the Metropolitan Police Force, a man whose chest was heavy with commendations, but whose reputation in the streets was notoriously dark. He was a hulking figure, built like a brick wall, with a thick neck, a square jaw, and eyes that held the perpetual disdain of a man who believed the law was merely a weapon he was licensed to wield. For years, Voss had run the infamous North District Vice Squad like his own personal mafia through extortion, falsified evidence, and brutal interrogations. The rumors were endless, but none had ever stuck. Voss always had the backing of the police union, and more importantly, he knew where the bodies were buried for half the city's political elite. He was, by all accounts, completely untouchable, until Valerie Kane stepped into the picture. Seated at the plaintiff's table, directly in Voss's line of sight, was the Honorable Member of Parliament for the North District, Valerie Kane. At 42 years old, Valerie was a force of nature. Born into a working-class family, she had escaped the gravity of her impoverished neighborhood by joining the military. She served in a highly specialized reconnaissance unit, completing grueling tours in hostile territories before returning home to earn a law degree. She traded her combat boots for tailored charcoal suits, but the warrior's posture never left her. She sat with a terrifying stillness, her spine perfectly straight, and her dark eyes locked onto Voss with the cold, calculating precision of a sniper peering through a scope. The hearing was part of an unprecedented civil inquiry into the North District precinct. Valerie had spearheaded the investigation after a botched, warrantless raid led by Voss had left an innocent family devastated. Despite receiving death threats, despite her office being vandalized, and despite the quiet warnings from her own political party to back down, Valerie had dragged Voss out of the shadows and into the glaring light of the High Court. Presiding over the chaos was Justice Everett Lang, a weary-looking judge nearing retirement who continually adjusted his spectacles as the temperature in his courtroom steadily climbed. Attorney Nolan Carver, Valerie's lead counsel, paced in front of the stand. "I direct your attention to Exhibit C, the body camera footage from the night of the raid. The footage that conveniently cuts out precisely before the door to the residence was breached. Can you explain this malfunction?" Voss leaned back in the wooden chair, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He did not look at the lawyer. He looked directly at Valerie. A sneer played at the corner of his lips. "As I have stated in my deposition, the equipment issued to the squad is outdated. Technical failures are common. It is a tragedy, but it is not a conspiracy." "A technical failure?" Carver repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "A technical failure that affected the cameras of all 6 officers simultaneously. What are the mathematical odds of that, Sergeant?" "I am a police officer, not a mathematician," Voss snapped, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "We were doing our jobs. We were clearing a dangerous sector, something politicians who sit in their ivory towers would not understand." The jab was entirely directed at Valerie. The public gallery murmured. Justice Lang banged his gavel twice. "Order. Sergeant Voss, confine your answers to the questions asked. The gallery will remain silent." Valerie did not flinch. She simply picked up a pen, made a single, precise note on her legal pad, and looked back up at Voss. That quiet, unbothered motion infuriated him more than any screaming match could have. For years, Voss had relied on intimidation. He was used to people averting their gaze. He was used to suspects trembling in holding cells and junior officers bowing to his whims. Valerie Kane's total lack of fear was a direct threat to his entire reality. Attorney Carver continued, pulling a stack of financial documents from his briefcase. "Let's move away from the electronics. Let's talk about the missing seized assets from the lockup. $400,000 in untraceable cash vanished. Yet later, your estranged ex-wife, ex-wife Nora Miller, deposited $80,000 into an offshore account, an account that you are listed as a secondary beneficiary on." Voss's face turned a dangerous shade of red. His neck bulged against the tight collar of his dress uniform. "That money was an inheritance," he growled, leaning forward. The wooden witness chair creaked under his shifting weight. "An inheritance from whom?" Carver pressed. "Her parents have been deceased for over a decade, and they died penniless." "Objection! Badgering the witness!" shouted Voss's defense attorney, a sweaty, overworked lawyer named Miles Corbin. "Overruled," Justice Lang said flatly. "Answer the question, Sergeant." "I don't keep track of my ex-wife's finances," Voss shouted, his composure rapidly fracturing. "This entire inquiry is a witch hunt. It is a political stunt orchestrated by a woman who hates law enforcement and wants to make a name for herself by destroying real cops." Voss pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at Valerie. Valerie finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a resonant, commanding authority that effortlessly cut through the acoustics of the large room. "Sergeant Voss," she said calmly, leaning forward slightly, "no one here hates law enforcement. What we hate are thugs wearing badges. You have used the uniform to shield yourself from the very laws you swore to uphold. And today, that shield breaks." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled frantically. Activists in the back row cheered. Voss gripped the edges of the witness box, his knuckles turning white. He looked like a cornered bull, eyes wide and bloodshot, breath hissing through his teeth. Justice Lang slammed his wooden gavel down repeatedly. "Order. Order in this court. I will clear this room if I have to. Ms. Kane, you are not examining the witness. Mr. Carver, control your client. This court will take a recess to allow tempers to cool. When we return, I expect absolute professionalism. Bailiff, secure the witness." The judge stood and retreated to his chambers. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. The loud hum of overlapping conversations instantly filled the void as the gallery stretched their legs. It was supposed to be a standard cooling-off period. It became the most infamous recess in legal history. As the judge left, the rigid structure of the courtroom dissolved. Lawyers began shuffling papers. The gallery buzzed with gossip and hurried phone calls. Attorney Carver leaned down to whisper something into Valerie's ear, pointing at a line in the financial documents. Valerie nodded, her face a mask of total concentration. Across the room, Sergeant Harlan Voss stepped down from the witness box. His attorney, Miles Corbin, immediately grabbed his arm, whispering frantically, trying to rein in his completely unhinged client. Voss shoved Corbin away with such force that the lawyer stumbled backward into the defense table. Voss was not looking at his lawyer. He was looking at Valerie. The humiliation was eating him alive. In his mind, he was the king of the streets, the apex predator of the North District. And here he was being vivisected in public, having his finances, his failed marriage, and his dirty deeds laid bare for the world to see. All because of a black woman who dared to tell him he was not a god. The toxic cocktail of racism, misogyny, and bruised ego short-circuited whatever remaining rational thought he possessed. Ignoring the bailiff, a young, slightly timid officer named Doyle, who was technically supposed to escort him to the holding room, Voss began walking across the well of the court. The well is the sacred space in a courtroom between the judge's bench and the attorney's tables. It is strictly off-limits to witnesses unless explicitly directed, but Voss marched right into it, his heavy black shoes thudding against the polished marble floor. "Sergeant, please return to your table," Officer Doyle called out, his voice lacking the necessary authority to stop a charging bull. Voss ignored him. He walked straight toward the plaintiff's table. Carver, noticing the massive man approaching out of the corner of his eye, stood up instinctively, stepping between Voss and Valerie. "Sergeant, you need to step back now," Carver warned, his voice tight with sudden alarm. "Get out of my way, suit!" Voss snarled, shoving the lawyer aside with a massive hand. Carver stumbled, hitting the edge of the heavy wooden table. Now, there was nothing between Voss and Valerie. Valerie slowly stood up. She did not retreat. She did not call for the bailiff. She stood at her full height, which was considerably shorter than Voss's towering 6'3" frame. But her presence seemed to fill the space. She looked him dead in the eyes, her expression completely devoid of fear. "You think you've won, don't you?" Voss hissed, stepping so close that the stench of old coffee and nervous sweat radiated off him. "You think you can drag me in here, disrespect me in front of the city, and just walk away? I run the North District. You're nothing but a loudmouth politician." The courtroom had gone deathly quiet. The murmurs had died instantly. Every single eye, every single camera lens in the gallery was locked onto the confrontation. Even the reporters had stopped breathing. "You don't run anything anymore, Vance," Valerie said, her voice dropping to a low, quiet register, meant only for him. "You're a common criminal, and by the time I'm done with you, you'll be sharing a cell with the men you put away." The words triggered an explosion. Voss lost his mind. With a guttural roar of pure, unfiltered rage, he drew back his right hand. It was not a push. It was not a shove. He swung his massive, meaty hand in a brutal, open-palmed slap aimed directly at Valerie's face. Crack! The sound of the impact echoed through the high-ceilinged courtroom like a gunshot. The sheer force of the blow snapped Valerie's head to the side. Her glasses flew off her face, clattering onto the marble floor. A collective, horrified shriek erupted from the gallery. Officer Doyle finally jolted into action, lunging forward, shouting for backup on his radio. But what happened next defied everything Voss thought he knew about the world. He expected her to fall. He expected her to cry, to crumble, to be broken by his physical dominance, just like every other victim he had brutalized over his career. He was dead wrong. Valerie Kane did not fall. The kinetic energy of the slap rotated her torso, but her feet, planted in a perfectly balanced stance drilled into her over years of military hand-to-hand combat training, never moved. She absorbed the shock. Her chin tucked. Her jaw remained rigid. Time seemed to dilate in the courtroom. Slowly, terrifyingly, Valerie turned her head back to face him. Her cheek was rapidly bruising, a bright red welt blooming against her dark skin, a small cut opening on her lower lip. But her eyes were not those of a victim. They were the eyes of a soldier who had just been cleared to engage. Voss blinked momentarily, paralyzed by confusion. Why was she not on the floor? Why was she not screaming? Before his brain could process the tactical error he had just made, Valerie moved. She did not just hit him. She disassembled him. With blinding speed, Valerie shifted her weight to her front foot. Her left hand shot up, hooking the back of Voss's thick neck, pulling his head forward and instantly breaking his posture. In the same fluid, explosive motion, she drove her right palm upward, the heel of her hand striking perfectly against the point of Voss's jaw. The physiological response to a strike at that precise angle is immediate and undeniable. It causes the brain to violently twist inside the skull, instantly shutting off the body's central nervous system. Thwack! The impact was sickeningly loud. Voss's eyes instantly rolled back into his head. His arms dropped limply to his sides like dead weight. The massive 240-pound police sergeant went completely rigid for a fraction of a second before collapsing straight backward. He hit the marble floor with a concussive thud that shook the front row. He did not twitch. He did not groan. He was knocked out completely, deeply, and unequivocally cold. Silence slammed back down on the courtroom. It was profound, absolute silence. No one moved. The bailiff, halfway to the table, froze with his hand on his baton, staring wide-eyed at the unconscious mountain of a man on the floor. The reporters in the gallery sat with their mouths hanging open. Even Carver, rubbing his bruised arm, was staring in sheer disbelief. Valerie stood over the unconscious officer. She did not celebrate. She did not yell. Her breathing was steady, perfectly controlled. She calmly reached into the pocket of her blazer, pulled out a stark white handkerchief, and dabbed the small bead of blood from her lower lip. Then she bent down, picked up her glasses from the floor, inspected them for damage, and slid them back onto her face. She turned to the completely paralyzed bailiff. "Officer Doyle," Valerie said, her voice perfectly polite, echoing through the stunned silence of the room. "I believe the sergeant has tripped. You may want to call for an ambulance, and when he wakes up, kindly inform him that I am pressing charges for assaulting a member of Parliament." She turned around, sat back down in her leather chair, picked up her pen, and waited for the judge to return. The karma had struck with the force of a freight train, but the nightmare for Harlan Voss had only just begun. For a long moment after Valerie Kane resumed her seat, Courtroom 4 was a vacuum of sound and motion. Then the dam broke. The gallery exploded into sheer bedlam. Reporters, realizing they had just witnessed the political and legal story of the decade, trampled over each other to burst through the heavy double doors. Cell phones were already raised, thumbs flying across screens to dispatch breaking news alerts. Inside the well, Officer Doyle finally snapped out of his paralysis, his hands shaking as he keyed his shoulder mic to call for an EMT unit. Justice Everett Lang burst back through his chamber doors, having heard the sickening thwack of the strike through the thick oak. He froze at the top of the bench, staring down at the massive, unconscious body of Sergeant Harlan Voss sprawled across the marble, then looked at Valerie, who was calmly reviewing a financial ledger. "What in God's name happened here?" Lang bellowed, his voice cracking with unprecedented panic. Before anyone could answer, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and 3 paramedics rushed down the center aisle, bags of gear rattling against their sides. They surrounded Voss. One paramedic shone a pen light into his unresponsive, dilated eyes, while another stabilized his thick neck, barking orders to prepare a backboard. Within minutes, the video leaked. While the official court cameras were strictly controlled, a young paralegal sitting in the second row of the gallery had covertly recorded the entire exchange on her smartphone, hiding the lens behind a stack of binders. The angle was imperfect, slightly obscured by the shoulder of the man in front of her. But the audio was crystal clear, and the visual of the swift takedown was absolute. By the time the paramedic strapped a neck collar onto Voss and hoisted him onto a gurney, the video had crossed 1 million views on social media. By the time the ambulance doors slammed shut, it had hit 10 million. Across town, in the plush, cigar-scented offices of the Metropolitan Police Union, President Roy Crow was having a catastrophic morning. Crow was a ruthless fixer, a man who had spent years making the sins of dirty cops disappear into the bureaucratic ether. He was in the middle of a meeting when his director of public relations slammed a laptop down on his desk and hit play. Crow watched the footage, the color drained from his face. He watched Voss lose his temper, march across the well, and deliver a brutal, open-handed strike to a sitting member of Parliament. Then he watched the politician slip the blow and deliver a devastating counterstrike that dropped his most protected, albeit problematic sergeant like a felled redwood. "Get Corbin on the phone," Crow snapped, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and absolute dread. "Right now." Miles Corbin, Voss's sweating defense attorney, picked up on the first ring. He was standing in the courthouse hallway, looking like a man who had just watched his career evaporate. "Roy, it's a disaster," Corbin stammered. "He just lost it. He hit her in front of the judge, the press, everybody." Crow rubbed his temples, his mind racing through the old playbook. "Listen to me, Miles. We control the narrative." Voss was under immense stress. The hostile questioning triggered a medical episode, a sudden, severe blood sugar drop that caused a violent physical spasm. The MP, in a disproportionate and highly aggressive display of martial force, assaulted an incapacitated officer. That's the line. You leak that out to the friendlies in the press right now. "Roy, you haven't seen the high-angle footage?" Corbin whispered, his voice utterly defeated. "What high-angle footage?" "The court's official security feed. Lang just released it to the prosecutor's office, and it's already been subpoenaed by the ethics committee. It shows the whole well. It shows Voss threatening her, calling her a loudmouth, and intentionally rearing back to strike. There's no medical episode, Roy. It's premeditated assault on a public official and the counterstrike, the use of force. Experts are already on the news calling it a textbook, legally justified, proportionate self-defense maneuver by a trained civilian. We have no spin for this." Crow leaned back in his leather chair, the heavy silence of the room pressing in on him. The blue wall of silence, the unwritten rule that cops protect cops at all costs, was a formidable fortress. But even a fortress crumbles when hit by a nuclear bomb. Defending a cop who slapped a black female member of parliament in an open courtroom was professional suicide. "Cut him loose," Crow said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "What?" Corbin gasped. "Roy, he's got dirt on half the precinct. If we burn him—" "I said cut him loose!" Crow roared, slamming his fist onto the mahogany desk. "The union officially condemns his actions. We are withdrawing his legal funding effective immediately. Let the wolves have him. If we stand by Harlan Voss today, the Federal Oversight Committee will disband this entire union tomorrow." Crow hung up the phone. The karma was no longer just a concept. It was a systemic purge, and Voss was standing directly at ground zero, completely unaware. Consciousness returned to Harlan Voss like a sledgehammer to the skull. The first thing he registered was the blinding, sterile fluorescence of a hospital ceiling. The second was the agonizing, throbbing pain radiating from the right side of his face. It felt as though his jaw had been unhinged and reattached with rusted wire. He tried to open his mouth to groan, but a sharp spike of agony shot behind his eyes, forcing him to keep his teeth gritted together. He blinked, his vision slowly swimming into focus. He expected to see the familiar, sympathetic faces of his squad mates. He expected to see Roy Crow standing at the foot of his bed, assuring him that the union lawyers were already twisting the story, filing assault charges against Valerie Kane, and making the nightmare go away. Instead, the room was distinctly empty of friendly uniforms. Standing by the window, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light, was a woman in a sharp navy blue suit. She had short, meticulously styled silver hair and held a manila folder tucked under one arm. Voss's stomach plummeted. It was Captain Lena Shaw, the commanding officer of the anti-corruption unit. She was the Grim Reaper of the Metropolitan Police Force. Shaw turned around, her expression entirely devoid of sympathy. She walked to the side of the hospital bed, pulling up a plastic chair, and sat down. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Mr. Voss," Shaw said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Notice, Mr. Voss, not Sergeant." Voss tried to sit up, a reflexive surge of defensive anger boiling in his chest. But as he shifted his weight, his right arm jerked to a sudden metallic halt. He looked down. Thick steel handcuffs secured his right wrist to the heavy metal railing of the hospital bed. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through his concussive haze. "What the hell is this?" Voss slurred, his words thick and clumsy around his swollen jaw. "Take these off me, Shaw. I was assaulted. That lunatic politician." "Save your breath. The doctors say your jaw is fractured in 2 places. You're going to need surgery," Shaw interrupted smoothly, opening the manila folder on her lap. "As for the handcuffs, they remain exactly where they are. You are officially under arrest, Vance." "On whose authority?" Voss spat, wincing at the pain it caused. "Get Roy Crow down here. Get my union rep." Shaw offered a thin, utterly joyless smile. She reached into the folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper with the official police union letterhead, and held it up for him to read. "Mr. Crow sends his regards," Shaw said. "The union released a public statement. They have categorically condemned your actions, terminated your membership pending the outcome of your criminal trial, and withdrawn all legal representation. You are entirely on your own." Voss stared at the paper. The words blurred together. It was impossible. For years, the union had been his impenetrable armor. They had buried civilian complaints, hidden missing evidence, and shielded him from every consequence of his brutal reign over the North District. "They can't do that," he whispered, the reality of his isolation sinking in. "They can, and they did," Shaw replied, sliding the paper back into the folder. "The moment you crossed the well and laid hands on Valerie Kane, you ceased to be a police officer and became a catastrophic liability. The high court cameras caught every frame, Vance. The audio is pristine. We have you threatening her, striking her, and then receiving what the district attorney has officially classified as justified, defensive, and proportional force." Shaw leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "You didn't just assault a woman in a courtroom. You assaulted an elected official during an active judicial inquiry. The charges are aggravated assault on a public servant, contempt of court, and felony intimidation of a witness. The judge has already denied bail, citing you as a danger to the public and a severe flight risk." Voss yanked at the handcuffs, the metal biting painfully into his thick wrist. "I gave years to this city. I bled for this badge. You think you can just throw me in a cage because some suit got lucky with a lucky punch?" "It wasn't a lucky punch, Vance," Shaw said quietly. "Did you ever bother to read Ms. Kane's file before you tried to intimidate her? She was a combatives instructor for the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion. She spent years teaching special operators how to neutralize hostile threats in close-quarters combat. You didn't intimidate her. You handed her the legal and physical justification to dismantle you." Shaw stood up, buttoning her suit jacket. She looked down at the broken, disgraced man in the bed. "Your badge has been revoked. Your locker is currently being emptied by Internal Affairs. And as for that offshore account your ex-wife suddenly funded, we've frozen it. The federal investigators are already tracing the serial numbers back to the North District evidence lockup." She turned and walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "The surgery is scheduled," Shaw said, not looking back. "When you wake up from the anesthesia, 2 deputies will transport you directly to the maximum security wing of the County Detention Center. You'll be housed in solitary for your own protection. Have a good night, Mr. Voss." The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving Vance Voss chained to a bed, utterly alone, as the empire of corruption he had built burned to the ground around him. The city awoke to a media landscape completely dominated by a single looping video clip. Every major news network played the footage of Sergeant Harlan Voss striking Valerie Kane, followed immediately by his catastrophic neutralization. Late-night talk show hosts dissected the counterstrike. Martial arts analysts broke down the biomechanics of Valerie's palm strike on morning television, praising her impeccable footwork and situational awareness. But Valerie Kane was not interested in being a viral sensation. She was a tactician. She knew that a fleeting window of internet fame was useless unless it was weaponized to dismantle the corruption she had originally set out to expose. A press conference was called on the imposing marble steps of the High Court of Justice. The turnout was historic. A forest of microphones bristled on the wooden podium. Dozens of camera crews jockeyed for position, their lenses focused on the heavy brass doors of the courthouse. When Valerie finally emerged, flanked by her lead counsel, Nolan Carver, and a tight security detail, a tidal wave of camera flashes illuminated the overcast morning. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, professional knot. But what captured the lenses of every photographer was the stark, undeniable plum-colored bruise blossoming across her left cheekbone, right beneath her glasses. She wore no makeup to conceal it. The bruise was the undeniable evidence of Voss's brutality, worn as a badge of absolute defiance. "Ms. Kane! Ms. Kane!" A dozen reporters shouted simultaneously, thrusting recording devices forward. "Are you pressing criminal charges? How did you learn to strike like that? Have you heard from the police union?" Valerie stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphones. She waited. She did not raise her hands to quiet the crowd. She simply stood with that terrifying, familiar stillness until the sheer weight of her presence forced the press corps into silence. "Good morning," Valerie began, her voice steady, projecting effortlessly over the crowd. "Yesterday, in the sanctuary of a court of law, I was violently assaulted by an active-duty sergeant of the Metropolitan Police. The footage of that assault and my subsequent legal self-defense has been widely circulated. I am physically bruised, but I assure you, I am entirely undeterred." She paused, looking out over the sea of reporters. "However," she continued, her tone sharpening into a razor edge, "if we focus solely on a momentary physical altercation, we are failing the citizens of this city. Sergeant Harlan Voss did not strike me simply because he lost his temper. He struck me because he was backed into a corner. He struck me because for the first time in his career, the shadows he operates in were being exposed to the light. He struck me out of the desperate terror of a man whose criminal enterprise was collapsing in real time. A ripple of shock went through the press corps. Valerie was not playing the victim, and she was not gloating about the knockout. She was pivoting. She was using the massive spotlight of her viral moment to incinerate the North District Vice Squad. "This is no longer just a civil inquiry into one botched raid," Valerie announced, pulling a thick stack of subpoenaed financial ledgers from Nolan Carver and resting them on the podium. "Following the events of yesterday and the sudden freezing of offshore accounts linked to Sergeant Voss and his associates, I have spent the night in direct communication with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The reporters began frantically typing on their phones. The word federal changed everything. As of this morning, the Department of Justice has officially opened a sweeping RICO investigation into the North District Precinct. They will be auditing every arrest, every seized asset, and every internal affairs complaint buried by the local union over the last decade. Sergeant Voss's assault on me was not an anomaly. It was the standard operating procedure of a gang wearing badges, and today that gang is out of business. "Ms. Kane!" shouted Sarah Trent, a veteran investigative reporter for the Daily Tribune. "The police union officially severed ties with Voss late last night. Does this satisfy your demands for accountability?" Valerie offered a cold, humorless smile. The union cutting ties with Harlan Voss after he became a public relations nightmare is an act of cowardice, not accountability. Sarah, they protected him for years. They funded his legal defenses while he terrorized marginalized communities. Throwing him under the bus only after he embarrassed them on national television does not absolve the union leadership of their complicity. We will be looking at them next. It was a masterstroke. In less than 5 minutes, Valerie had successfully weaponized her assault, using the public outrage to bypass the local corrupt authorities and bring the full crushing weight of the federal government down on her enemies. As she stepped away from the podium, leaving the press corps in an absolute frenzy, Nolan Carver leaned in. "You just declared war on the entire establishment," he murmured, a mix of awe and anxiety in his voice. Valerie adjusted her glasses, her bruised cheek throbbing in the morning air. "They declared war on my community a long time ago, Nolan. I'm just the one bringing it to an end. Pain, hot, jagged, and relentless." That was the entirety of Vance Voss's existence. As the heavy steel doors of the county transport van rattled and banged against the pothole-ridden streets, the surgery to repair his jaw had taken hours. The surgeons had inserted 2 titanium plates and wired his jaw completely shut to prevent the bones from shifting. His face was swollen to the size of a melon, mottled with deep purple and sickly yellow bruising. Every jolt of the suspension sent a fresh wave of agony radiating through his skull, but the physical pain was secondary to the absolute suffocating terror of his current reality. He was wearing an oversized, violently bright orange jumpsuit. His wrists were shackled to a thick leather belly chain, which was in turn shackled to his ankles. He was no longer Sergeant Harlan Voss, the untouchable king of the North District. He was inmate number 84792, property of the state. The transport van groaned to a halt. The heavy rear doors swung open, revealing the imposing razor-wire-topped walls of the Blackgate County Detention Center. It was a maximum security holding facility, a grim concrete fortress that housed the city's most violent offenders while they awaited trial. 2 heavily armored transport deputies grabbed Voss by the arms, dragging him out of the van. He stumbled, his leg chains clanking loudly against the concrete loading dock. "Keep your head down and walk, tough guy," one of the deputies grunted, shoving him toward the processing entrance. Voss tried to speak, tried to assert some shred of his former authority, but with his jaw wired shut, all that escaped his lips was a muffled, pathetic groan. He was marched through the sterilized, fluorescent-lit corridors of processing. He was stripped, sprayed with freezing delousing chemicals, and issued a scratchy wool blanket and a thin plastic mattress. There was no professional courtesy. There were no winks or nods from the correction officers. The blue wall of silence did not extend to Blackgate. The guards here answered to Warden Harlan Reed, a strict, uncompromising administrator who despised dirty cops because they made his job infinitely harder. Voss was escorted to the warden's office before his cell assignment. Warden Reed, a lean, gray-haired man with eyes like chipped flint, looked up from a stack of paperwork as Voss was forced into a steel chair. "Well," Reed said softly, leaning back in his chair, "if it isn't the pride of the Metropolitan Police. I watched the video, Voss. We all did. You hit a woman and you got put to sleep. That's a tough look for a man entering this facility." Voss glared, his chest heaving, his nose whistling as he struggled to breathe through the swelling. "Now," Reed continued, folding his hands on the desk. "Normally, a high-profile ex-cop like you would be placed in administrative segregation, protective custody. We put you in a nice, quiet cell away from the general population so you don't get a shiv in your ribs during recreation." Voss nodded frantically. That was the protocol. That was the only way he survived this. "However," Reed said, his voice dropping an octave, "because of the federal RICO charges brought down this morning, the feds have designated you a high-value flight and tampering risk. The federal wing is currently undergoing renovations, which means, unfortunately, I don't have a luxury suite available for you." Panic seized Voss's chest. He tried to stand, but the deputies pushed him hard back into the chair. "I'm placing you in cell block D," Reed announced. "It's a high-security medical wing, seeing as you need liquid meals and constant monitoring for that jaw. You'll be locked down 23 hours a day. But here is the reality of your situation, Voss. Cell block D is where we house the overflow of the violent offenders. Many of them are from the North District. Many of them, I suspect, you put here." Voss let out a muffled scream of protest through his wired teeth. He was thrashing against the chains. He knew who was in Block D: cartel enforcers, gang lieutenants, men he had beaten, extorted, and framed. Putting him in that block, even behind a steel door, was a death sentence. "You reap what you sow, inmate," Reed said coldly, turning back to his paperwork. "Get him out of my office." The walk to Block D was the longest walk of Vance Voss's life. As the heavy steel security doors slid open with a mechanical shriek, the smell of sweat, industrial bleach, and raw hostility hit him like a physical blow. The cell block was a two-tiered concrete cavern. Dozens of steel bar doors lined the walls. As the deputies marched him down the central walkway, the murmurs began. Word travels fast in a prison. They knew who he was. They knew he was coming. A face pressed against the thick plexiglass of Cell 4. It was Hector Ramirez, a man Voss had brutally beaten during an interrogation years prior. Ramirez tapped on the glass, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his face as he looked at Voss's swollen, wired-shut jaw. "Hey, Sergeant," a voice echoed off the concrete walls from the upper tier. "I saw the video. You got dropped by a politician. How's the jaw?" "Pig." Laughter, cold and cruel, erupted from the surrounding cells. "You belong to us now, Voss," another voice shouted, followed by the terrifying sound of a tin cup rattling against steel bars. "We got all the time in the world." Voss felt his knees go weak. The swagger, the arrogance, the absolute certainty of his own invincibility, it all evaporated into the stale prison air. He was shoved into a small, windowless concrete cell at the end of the block. The deputies removed his chains, stepped out, and the heavy electronic door slammed shut with a deafening finality. The lock engaged with a heavy clack. Voss stood alone in the dim light of the cell. Through the small grating in his door, the taunts and threats of the men he had tormented continued to echo, a relentless chorus of impending doom. He slumped onto the thin plastic mattress, curling his massive frame into a ball, weeping silently through his wired jaw. The karma had not just hit back. It had swallowed him whole. The wheels of federal justice are notoriously slow, grinding away in the background with agonizing deliberation. But when they finally catch traction, they do not merely punish. They pulverize everything in their path. For the North District Vice Squad, the end did not come with a polite warning or a quiet internal memo. It came with a synchronized tactical sledgehammer that shattered their corrupt ecosystem before most of them had even had their morning coffee. A fleet of unmarked matte black tactical vehicles swarmed the North District precinct. FBI Special Agent Derek Kane, a man legendary for dismantling organized crime syndicates across the eastern seaboard, led the charge alongside Captain Lena Shaw of the Anti-Corruption Unit. They did not just audit the precinct. They completely gutted it. Heavily armed federal agents breached the front doors, securing the perimeter and locking down every exit. Officers on the morning shift were ordered against the walls, stripped of their badges, radios, and firearms before the sun had even fully breached the horizon. The raid was meticulous and devastating. Agents tore through the ceiling tiles in the locker room, unearthing hidden stashes of burner phones, unregistered firearms, and bundles of extorted cash. Hard drives were seized, decades of physical evidence lockers were sealed, and boxes upon boxes of falsified arrest records were carted out into waiting federal trucks. The culture of untouchable arrogance that Voss had so carefully cultivated evaporated in an instant. The infamous blue wall of silence did not just crack, it completely collapsed under the terrifying threat of federal indictments. Hardened detectives, men who used to terrorize the streets with impunity, found themselves sitting in windowless FBI interrogation rooms, sweating through their shirts. Desperate to avoid long sentences in federal penitentiaries, Voss's most loyal lieutenants instantly turned into cowards. They scrambled over one another to sign plea deals, eagerly trading testimonies for leniency. They detailed every extortion ring, every planted bag of narcotics, and every brutal beating Voss had ever ordered. The gang with badges had turned on its leader. Later, the city found itself back in a courtroom, but the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. The air was no longer thick with the oppressive threat of a corrupt cop. It was charged with the electric anticipation of long overdue justice. The trial of Vance Voss was swift, merciless, and completely devoid of the theatrical, chest-puffing arrogance he had displayed at his civil inquiry. He sat at the defense table, a vastly diminished shadow of a man. He had lost weight during his grueling stint in the high-security medical wing of the county detention center. The titanium plates surgically inserted to reconstruct his shattered jaw had healed, but they left the lower half of his face slightly asymmetrical, a permanent physical monument to the exact moment that ended his reign. He wore an ill-fitting standard-issue gray suit provided by his court-appointed public defender. Throughout the entire proceeding, his wrists remained shackled to a heavy metal waist chain, a severe security measure that constantly reminded the jury exactly who they were dealing with. Valerie Kane took the witness stand on the third day of the trial. She did not wear the fading scars of her assault to garner sympathy. She wore a sharp charcoal blazer and the calm, unshakable authority of a woman who had already won the war. When the lead federal prosecutor, a razor-sharp litigator named Elena Reed, queued up the infamous courtroom video, the jury leaned forward in stunned silence. They watched the footage frame by excruciating frame. They saw the massive police sergeant cross the well. They heard the sickening crack of his brutal slap. And they watched Valerie's flawlessly executed tactical neutralization that left the 240-pound man unconscious on the marble. "Ms. Kane," Prosecutor Reed asked, her voice echoing perfectly in the pin-drop silence of the room, stepping away from the monitor. "When the defendant struck you with such overwhelming physical force in an open courtroom, no less, did you fear for your life?" Valerie looked directly across the room at Voss. He could not meet her gaze. He stared down at his shackled, trembling hands, his spirit entirely broken by the sheer weight of his humiliation and impending doom. "I did not fear for my life, Ms. Reed," Valerie answered, her tone smooth, analytical, and devastatingly calm. "I recognized a bully who had simply run out of victims who could not fight back. For years, he relied on a tin badge and an armed squad to commit violence with absolute impunity. When he crossed that courtroom well, he left his badge behind. So I responded to him not as a police officer, but as a violent, out-of-control assailant. I neutralized the immediate threat to my own safety and, by extension, the ongoing threat he posed to the citizens of this city." The jury deliberated for a short time. When they returned, the foreperson, a retired schoolteacher with a stern expression, read the verdict with a loud, steady voice. Guilty on all counts. Aggravated assault on a public servant, felony witness intimidation, federal racketeering, extortion, severe civil rights violations under color of law. Justice Everett Lang, who had retained jurisdiction to preside over the criminal trial and see the saga through to its absolute end, looked down at Voss from the high bench. There was no judicial mercy in Lang's eyes, only a profound, burning disgust for a man who had so deeply polluted the justice system. "Vance Voss," the judge's voice boomed, rattling the heavy oak panels of the room. "You were entrusted with the most sacred duty our society can bestow, to protect and serve the vulnerable. Instead, you built a parasitic fiefdom of fear, preying on the very people who relied on you for safety. Your brazen assault on a sitting member of Parliament in my courtroom was not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the ultimate arrogant manifestation of your belief that you were entirely above the law. Today, this court proves to you that you are not." Lang adjusted his spectacles, staring down at the sentencing document as if it were a death warrant. "On the federal charges of racketeering and civil rights abuses combined with the aggravated assault, I sentence you to a term in a maximum security federal penitentiary to be served without the possibility of early parole. You will be remanded into federal custody and transferred immediately." A heavy, collective exhale swept through the packed gallery as the federal marshals hauled Voss to his feet, leading him away by his chains to a life surrounded by the very criminal elements he had once brutally exploited. Valerie Kane remained seated at the plaintiff's table. She did not smile. She did not cheer. She did not gloat to the press. She simply capped her pen and closed her leather-bound notebook. The karma was complete. In the aftermath, the seized assets from Voss's illegal offshore accounts, totaling nearly $3 million, were aggressively redirected by federal mandate back into the very community he had ravaged. Valerie personally oversaw the allocation of those funds, tearing down an abandoned warehouse in the North District to build a state-of-the-art youth community center and funding an independent, heavily empowered civilian oversight board for the police department. Using the momentum from the trial, she went on to author sweeping, historic police reform legislation that eventually became the gold standard across the entire country. The corrupt sergeant thought he could silence a loudmouth politician with a single brutal slap. Instead, he awakened a sleeping giant, inadvertently handing her the exact hammer she needed to shatter his corrupt empire into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. What started as a shocking, split-second display of sheer arrogance in a courtroom ultimately became a masterclass in ultimate real-life karma. Vance Voss truly believed his badge made him a god among men, but Valerie Kane proved that true power does not come from a uniform or intimidation. It comes from disciplined courage and an absolute, uncompromising refusal to back down in the face of a bully. This story is a powerful, undeniable reminder that the shadows of systemic corruption can only survive until someone is finally brave enough to turn on the blinding lights. Those who were captivated by this intense, twist-filled story of justice served cold are encouraged to hit that like button right now. Share this incredible story of instant karma and systemic takedowns with friends, and subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping, real-life dramas where the bad guys get exactly what they deserve. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a thing.